The air inside the back room is thick, a heavy mixture of stale cigar smoke, expensive bourbon, and the metallic tang of impending violence. Outside, a light drizzle coats the Newark pavement in a greasy sheen. Inside, Arthur Flegenheimer, better known to the world as Dutch Schultz, is hunched over a table, a stack of ledgers spread out before him like a war map. His brow is furrowed, his fingers stained with ink and nicotine. He isn't looking at the door. He's looking at the numbers, trying to calculate how much the federal government is trying to bleed him for. Click. The sound of a heavy latch sliding into place. It's small, almost drowned out by the hum of the refrigerator, but to a man like Schultz, it sounds like a cannon blast. He doesn't look up yet. He knows that sound. It's the sound of a closing trap. To understand how the beer baron of the Bronx ended up in a dingy Newark restaurant, bleeding out his legacy, we have to go back exactly 2 hours, to a moment of pride, a moment of weakness, and a singular insult that broke the unspoken code of the 5 families. 2 hours ago, in a dimly lit social club in Manhattan, a man named Vincent Mad Dog Coll, a former protege turned bitter rival, did the unthinkable. In a room full of made men, he didn't just challenge Schultz's territory. He looked at a photograph of Schultz's wife, Frances, and their young child, and he spat. He didn't just spit. He uttered a phrase that questioned the lineage of the Schultz name, suggesting that while Dutch was hiding from the feds, his home was being tended to by others. In the underworld, you can steal a man's trucks, you can hijack his speakeasies, you can even shoot his lieutenants. But you do not touch the family. The moment those words left Coll's mouth, the clock started ticking. Not for Schultz, but for the man who dared to make it personal. Schultz rose from his chair, his eyes cold and vacant like 2 chips of flint. He didn't scream. He didn't throw a glass. He simply adjusted his tie. 2 hours, Schultz whispered to his bodyguard, Lulu Rosenkrantz. I want him gone before the ink on these ledgers is dry. But in the world of 1930s New York, a hit isn't just a murder. It's a message, and the message was about to be delivered in lead. Schultz thought he was the hunter, but as the shadows lengthened in Newark, he failed to realize that by breaking the peace to settle a personal score, he had just painted a target on his own back that the commission couldn't ignore. 3 weeks earlier, the Embassy Hotel, Manhattan. The Great Depression had turned New York into a city of breadlines and broken dreams, but for Dutch Schultz, it was a golden age. He sat at the top of a multi-million-dollar empire built on illegal needle beer and the numbers racket. Yet despite the wealth, Schultz lived like a man haunted. He paced the plush carpets of his hotel suite, the curtains drawn tight even in the afternoon sun. He was a man of contrasts, a ruthless killer who wore cheap, ill-fitting suits to avoid looking like a target, yet a man who possessed a volatile ego that could be bruised by a whisper. His empire was built on the fear he projected. He was the Dutchman, the man who once stuffed a rival into a trunk with a diseased bandage over his eyes, just to watch him go mad from the infection. The feds are breathing down my neck, Lulu, Schultz barked, gesturing to the newspaper on the mahogany desk. Thomas Dewey, the relentless special prosecutor, had made Schultz public enemy #1. They want the money, always the money. But the money wasn't his only problem. The young Turks of the mob, Lucky Luciano and Meyer Lansky, viewed Schultz as an unstable relic. He was too loud, too violent, and too unpredictable for their new syndicate model of organized crime. They wanted a corporation. Schultz was a warlord. The tension in the city was palpable. You could feel it in the way the street vendors lowered their heads when a black Cadillac rolled by. You could hear it in the silence of the docks. Schultz's power was absolute in the Bronx, but Manhattan was a chessboard, and he was losing pieces. The contextual reality was simple. Schultz was cornered. When a man like Schultz feels cornered, he doesn't retreat. He bites. He began demanding that the commission authorize the assassination of Thomas Dewey. A move so suicidal, it made Luciano's skin crawl. You don't kill the law, Dutch, Luciano had warned him in a secret meeting at a bathhouse, the steam obscuring their faces. You buy the law. If you kill Dewey, the whole world falls on us. Schultz didn't care about the world. He cared about his pride. This obsession with Dewey was blinding him to the viper in his own nest, Vincent Coll. Coll was younger, crazier, and had no respect for the hierarchy Schultz had spent a decade bleeding for. While Schultz was planning to war with the government, Mad Dog Koll was preparing a personal strike that would force the Dutchman's hand, leading to a decision that would violate the syndicate's most sacred rule. October 23rd, 1935, 8:00 p.m., the Vesuvio Social Club, East Harlem. The smell of garlic and heavy tobacco smoke filled the air. This was neutral ground, or so it was supposed to be. The Vesuvio was a place where business was conducted over espresso and anisette. Vincent Mad Dog Koll sat at a corner table, surrounded by 3 of his gunmen. He was lean, handsome in a jagged way, and possessed a smile that never reached his eyes. Koll had been hijacking Schultz's beer trucks for months, leaving a trail of bodies across the Harlem River. He wanted Schultz's throne, and he knew the Dutchman was distracted by his legal woes. The door opened, and one of Schultz's mid-level earners, a man named A.B. Misfit Landau, walked in to deliver a message regarding a disputed territory in Yonkers. The room went silent. The only sound was the clicking of billiard balls in the back. Koll didn't listen to the message. Instead, he pulled a crumpled newspaper clipping from his pocket, a society page photo of Schultz, his wife Frances, and their child at a quiet dinner. Koll smoothed it out on the table, his eyes gleaming with a malicious light. "Look at this," Koll said, his voice carrying across the hushed room. "The great Dutchman. Looks like a scared rabbit. And the wife." He paused, leaning in so Landau could smell the gin on his breath. "I hear she's looking for a real man, while Dutch is busy crying to his lawyers. Maybe the kid needs a father who isn't a coward." Then came the act that sealed his fate. Koll gathered a thick glob of phlegm and spat directly onto the image of the child. The silence that followed was suffocating. Landau froze. In the Italian and Jewish mobs of the 30s, there were lines you didn't cross. You didn't mention the old lady, and you certainly didn't bring the children into the gutter. It wasn't just an insult. It was a declaration of total, scorched earth war. "Tell the Dutchman," Koll sneered, "that his family is public property now, just like his beer roots." Landau backed out of the club, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He ran to the nearest payphone. He didn't call the police. He called the number for the Palace Chop House. He knew that by delivering this message, he was lighting a fuse that would blow the city apart. When Schultz received the call, those around him said his face didn't turn red with rage. It turned white, the color of bone. He realized then that he couldn't wait for the commission's permission anymore. 8:15 p.m., Palace Chop House back room. Schultz slammed the receiver down so hard the plastic cracked. His hands were shaking, not from fear, but from a primordial rage that bypassed reason. To Schultz, his family was the only thing that remained untainted by the filth of his trade. They were his legitimacy. "Lulu," Schultz said, his voice a low, vibrating growl. "Get the boys. I want Koll. I don't want him dead tomorrow. I want him erased before the night is out." Lulu Rosenkrantz, a hulking man who was as loyal as a dog and twice as lethal, hesitated. "Dutch, we're in Jersey. We're supposed to be laying low. If we send a hit squad into Manhattan now, the commission will—" "I don't give a damn about the commission," Schultz roared, throwing a glass of whiskey against the wall. The amber liquid dripped down the floral wallpaper like blood. "He spat on my blood, Lulu. He called my son a bastard in front of Harlem. If I don't kill him now, I'm not the boss. I'm just a target." The logistics were a nightmare. They had to mobilize shooters, coordinate with lookouts in Manhattan, and ensure that Koll didn't slip away into the labyrinth of the city's tenements. But Schultz had a secret weapon, a network of spotters who were more afraid of him than they were of the law. For the next 90 minutes, the Palace Chop House became a war room. Phone calls were made in code. "The package needs delivery. The dry cleaning is ready." Schultz sat there checking his pocket watch every 5 minutes. The decision was a tactical disaster. By focusing all his energy on Koll, Schultz was leaving his own flank exposed. He was so blinded by the personal insult that he failed to see the shadows moving outside his own windows. In the world of the mob, when a boss loses his cool, he loses his crown. Meanwhile, across the river in Manhattan, Mad Dog Koll was feeling invincible. He believed Schultz was too paralyzed by the Dewey investigation to strike back. He went to a drugstore on 23rd Street to make a call from a phone booth, a fatal mistake of routine. As the clock ticked toward 10 p.m., Schultz received a tip. Coll was at the pharmacy. The hit was moving into place. But Schultz didn't know that Lucky Luciano had already held a vote. The Dutchman had become too much of a liability. 10:10 p.m., 23rd Street, Manhattan. The street was quiet, the air misting with a cold Atlantic fog. Vincent Coll stepped into the glass-paneled phone booth inside a drugstore. He was relaxed, laughing as he talked into the receiver. He thought he was the apex predator of New York. Suddenly, a dark sedan screeched to a halt outside. 3 men in long overcoats stepped out. They didn't look like gangsters. They looked like businessmen finishing a late shift. One carried a Thompson submachine gun hidden under a folded newspaper. They didn't hesitate. They didn't exchange words. The lead shooter kicked open the drugstore door. The pharmacist ducked behind the counter. Coll, trapped in the narrow glass coffin of the phone booth, looked up just in time to see the muzzle flash. Rat-tat-tat-tat-tat. The glass shattered in a rhythmic explosion of shards. Coll was stitched from chest to head by 15 rounds of .45 caliber lead. He collapsed inside the booth, the receiver dangling by its cord, emitting a haunting rhythmic beep, the off-hook signal that sounded like a mechanical heartbeat. Back in Newark, Schultz got the word. It's done. The dog is buried. Schultz let out a breath he seemed to have been holding for hours. He felt a grim satisfaction. He had protected his honor. He had shown the world that no one insults the Flegenheimer name and lives to see the dawn. He turned back to his ledgers at the Palace Chop House, feeling like the king of the Bronx once again. But the vanishing wasn't just about Coll's life ending. It was about the vacuum it created. The hit was loud, messy, and unauthorized. It gave the syndicate the exact excuse they needed. Schultz had drawn too much heat. He had acted on emotion, not business. The theme of the night was consequence. Every bullet fired into that phone booth was a nail in Schultz's own coffin. He thought he had won the war of respect, but he had actually signed his own death warrant. Schultz poured himself a celebratory drink, unaware that the men who had just killed Coll were not the only shooters on the streets that night. Another team was already crossing the bridge into New Jersey. 10:25 p.m., Palace Chop House, Newark. The atmosphere in the restaurant had shifted. The few regular patrons had sensed the tension and slipped out the back. Only Schultz and his inner circle remained. Lulu Rosenkrantz, A.B. Landau, and Bernard Lulu Rosenkrantz. They were eating steak and fried potatoes, the mood light for the first time in weeks. "We'll go back to the Bronx tomorrow," Schultz said, chewing a piece of meat. "We'll show the commission that the Dutchman is still the law." Lulu nodded, but his hand stayed near the shoulder holster beneath his jacket. He was a professional. He knew that the moment after a hit is when you are most vulnerable. The adrenaline fades and the guard drops. Outside, a black Buick pulled up to the curb. 2 men stepped out, Charles the Bug, Workman, and Mendy Weiss, top assassins for murder Incans, the enforcement arm of the syndicate. They weren't there for Coll. They were there for the man who had ordered the hit on Coll. Workman walked into the restaurant with a calm, predatory grace. He headed straight for the men's room, passing Schultz's table. Schultz didn't even look up. He was too busy explaining a new numbers scheme to Landau. Workman entered the bathroom, pulled a .38 revolver, and waited. He wanted the boss. A moment later, the door to the restroom creaked open. It was Schultz. He needed to wash the ink and steak grease from his hands. He stood at the sink, looking at his tired reflection in the cracked mirror. He looked like a man who had finally found peace. Workman stepped out of the stall. Bang! The first shot hit Schultz in the back, just below the ribs. The force slammed him against the sink. He didn't scream, he just gasped, a wet, rattling sound. Workman didn't stay to finish him. He had more targets in the dining room. As Schultz slumped to the floor, the sound of heavy gunfire erupted in the dining room. The beer baron was dying in a puddle of soapy water, listening to his empire being dismantled 1 bullet at a time. 10:30 p.m., Palace Chop House, Newark. The dining room was a slaughterhouse. Mendy Weiss and Workman worked with clinical efficiency. Lulu Rosenkrantz tried to draw his weapon, but he was hit multiple times before he could clear his holster. He collapsed over the table, his blood mixing with the gravy on his plate. Landau was shot as he tried to dive behind the bar. The assassins didn't linger. They vanished into the Jersey night, leaving behind a silence so heavy it felt like a physical weight. Schultz, incredibly, was still alive. He crawled out of the bathroom, his hands clutching his stomach, trying to hold his intestines inside. He trailed a long, dark streak of blood across the linoleum floor. "Lulu," he wheezed. "Lulu, get the heat." But Lulu was gone. The beer baron was alone. When the police arrived 10 minutes later, they found a scene of carnage. They found Schultz sitting at a table, his head lolling, his eyes glassy. He wasn't talking about the shooters. He was delirious. As the paramedics loaded him onto a stretcher, Schultz began a famous feverish monologue that would go down in criminal history. He spoke in a stream of consciousness, a broken code of a dying mind. "A boy has never wept, nor dashed 1,000 Kim. French-Canadian bean soup. I want to pay. Let them leave me alone." The detectives leaned in, pens ready, hoping for a confession or the names of his killers. But Schultz was no longer in Newark. He was back in the Bronx, back in his childhood, back in a world where he wasn't a monster. The tragedy of the Dutchman was that in his final moments, the power, the money, and the respect he had killed for meant nothing. He was just a man terrified of the dark. As Schultz was rushed to Newark City Hospital, the doctors realized the bullet had been dirty. Rust and bacteria were already poisoning his blood. He had less than 20 hours to live, and the police were determined to squeeze every secret out of him before the end. October 24th, 1935, Newark City Hospital. The news of the shooting hit the front pages like a tidal wave. The Dutchman down. In the hallways of the hospital, police stood guard, but they weren't there to protect Schultz. They were there to ensure no one else got to him before he talked. Schultz lay in a bed, his body burning with fever. He was slipping in and out of consciousness, his words becoming more cryptic. The sidewalk was slippery. "She is a sweet girl. Stay away from the numbers." While Schultz lay dying, the commission was already moving. Lucky Luciano sat in a suite at the Waldorf Astoria, calmly dividing up Schultz's empire. The Bronx roots went to one family. The Harlem numbers went to another. By the time the sun set on October 24th, the Schultz organization had ceased to exist. This was the cold reality of the syndicate. There was no loyalty to a fallen king. There was only the business. Schultz's decision to avenge a personal insult had cost him everything, not because he lost the fight, but because he broke the stability of the system. Back at the hospital, Schultz's wife, Frances, the woman Mad Dog Cole had insulted, sat by his bed. She didn't look like the wife of a billionaire. She looked like a widow in waiting, terrified of the future. Schultz looked at her, his eyes clearing for a brief second. "I did it for us," he whispered. She didn't answer. She knew that doing it for them had left her alone in a world full of men like her husband. The cost of his honor was her husband's life and her child's safety. The effect lender was starting to take hold. People in the Bronx were already whispering that Schultz had hidden a treasure, a safe full of millions in gold and cash, somewhere in the Catskill Mountains, fearing the feds would seize it. The myth was replacing the man. As the clock ticked toward his final hour, Schultz made one last request. He didn't ask for a lawyer. He asked for a priest. The man who had ruled through fear was suddenly terrified of what lay beyond the veil. October 24th, 1935, 6:35 p.m., Newark City Hospital. Arthur Flegenheimer breathed his last. The official cause of death was peritonitis caused by the gunshot wound. He was 33 years old. His death marked the end of an era. The era of the freelance gangster, the wild-card boss who answered to no one, was over. From that day on, the board of directors, the commission, would rule New York with a corporate iron fist. The police never recovered the Schultz fortune. They searched his properties, tore up floorboards and interrogated his associates, but the millions he had boasted about vanished into the fog of history. Some say it's still buried near Phoenicia, New York, a silent testament to a man who trusted no one. But the real legacy was the blood. The hit on Mad Dog Coll and the subsequent execution of Schultz had claimed 5 lives in less than 24 hours. It was a surgical strike that proved the syndicate was more powerful than any individual legend. In the Bronx, the speakeasies stayed open, but the atmosphere had changed. The beer was still flowing, but the name Dutch Schultz was now spoken in hushed tones, a cautionary tale about the price of pride. He was the smartest man in the room, a former associate once said, until he stopped being a businessman and started being a husband. The moral was clear. In the underworld, emotion is a luxury that no one can afford. Schultz tried to bridge the gap between being a ruthless boss and a protective father, and the gap swallowed him whole. But even in death, Schultz had one last gift for the city. His dying words, transcribed by a police stenographer, would become one of the most famous and debated documents in the history of American crime, a surrealist poem of a life lived in the shadows. The Aftermath, St. Raymond's Cemetery, the Bronx. Dutch Schultz was buried in a modest grave. There was no grand procession, no thousands of mourners lining the streets. The world had already moved on. The commission had ensured that his name was scrubbed from the ledgers of power. The story of Dutch Schultz and Mad Dog Coll is more than a tale of a gang war. It's a study in the effetto lenda, the legend effect. We remember Schultz not for the beer he sold or the taxes he evaded, but for those 2 hours of madness. We remember the man who was so insulted by a spit on a photograph that he burned down his own house to kill the fire. Today, the Palace Chop House is gone. The 23rd Street drugstore is a different kind of shop, but the echoes of that night remain. Schultz thought he was protecting his family's honor. Instead, he left them with a name synonymous with a violent, ignominious end. He forgot the first rule of the concrete jungle. The city doesn't have a heart. It only has a stomach. And that night, it was hungry. Thomas Dewey, the man Schultz wanted to kill, went on to become the governor of New York and almost the president of the United States. Lucky Luciano built a global crime syndicate from a prison cell. And Dutch Schultz? He became a ghost story told to young hitters to remind them to keep their cool. The next time you see a grainy photo of a 1930s mobster, don't look at the gun. Look at the eyes. Look for the moment pride took over for profit. That's where the tragedy lives. Dutch Schultz chose his pride over his empire. He traded a multi-million-dollar kingdom for 2 hours of revenge. In his shoes, with your family's honor on the line and a rival spitting on your child's face, would you have waited for the commission's permission, or would you have pulled the trigger yourself? If you enjoyed this deep dive into the dark heart of New York history, hit the like button and subscribe. We're uncovering the stories the archives tried to bury. Comment below with The Dutchman if you want to see our next episode on the hunt for his lost millions in the Catskills. Thanks for watching. Stay sharp. The city never sleeps.